The Trump administration is using the pandemic as an excuse to expel thousands of children seeking asylum. And new reports show that children as young as 8 months old are being turned away without any indication of where they are going and without due process. Advocates say many are now virtually impossible to find. The Associated Press this week reporting on a 12-year-old boy and a 9-year-old sister who fled violence in Honduras and say they were lied to by officials and flown back without explanation. Here's the reporter on that story.
The kids had thought they would be reunited with their mother. In fact, when they were let out of the detention facility and taken onto a bus, they were told that they were going to be taken to a shelter and eventually reunited. Instead, they were placed by surprise to them onto this plane and deported to Honduras. And this is a practice that's happening routinely since March. And it's something that the Trump administration has said is necessary to prevent the spread of COVID-19.
While the Trump administration has been using the spread of COVID-19 to justify asylum restrictions, ICE officials still have not released children who were in family detention centers. A federal judge back in June warned detention centers were, quote, on fire. And this week, BuzzFeed reporting the number of immigrants who have died in ICE custody is the highest it has been since 2006. Joining me now, Lindsay Tuzlowski. She's the executive director of Immigrant Defenders Law Center. Lindsay, when we say that these children, that these babies are virtually impossible to find, what does that mean?
Well, that means that we're in a situation now where the government has created a parallel shadow system for dealing with children who come to the border seeking asylum. And it's truly frightening because normally when a child comes to the border and seeks asylum, they would be entered into proceedings that would allow them to go before a judge, that would put their welfare first by putting them into facilities that would reunite them with sponsors in the United States, or at least follow general child welfare standards while taking care of them. What we're seeing now is children who come to our border seeking protection, and they are just being expelled back. It's not even a legal process. They're being expelled back with no care being taken for what they were fleeing when they came to the United States, and no care being taken for what will happen to them when they go back. And many of these kids, we wouldn't even know who they are.
Underscore that. No, I want you to finish that thought, but I also want you to underscore for me what you just said, which is that this is not a legal process, because I think a lot of folks watching this are watching and wondering how this is happening and how this is allowed to continue if it is, in fact, as you say, not a legal process.
So the government is using the CDC ban on people coming into the United States because of COVID as a way to turn away asylum seekers. So there is no judge who gets to decide whether or not that person has a valid asylum claim. There's cursory screening being done for children as young as you said, 8 months old, to see whether or not they will be tortured if sent back to their home country. And so it is just simply a ban that's in place. And so people are expelled with no due process whatsoever. So when we say it's not a legal process, that's because all of the protections that have been put in place for asylum seekers, and particularly for children, as one of the most vulnerable populations of asylum seekers for decades, since the 80s, are being ignored, and children are simply being turned back. And we wouldn't even know who these children are if it wasn't for organizations like the Texas Civil Rights Project and Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center in El Paso, who are finding these children because family members are calling or because they're staking out hotels to see where they are. But for kids who they do not find, for more than 3,000 who've already been expelled, they may be returned directly to their traffickers or others. So the most vulnerable children will be the most at risk under this shadow system that the Trump administration has set up.
We're talking about two different things. We're talking, you and I first, about asylum seekers who in many cases are being turned back at the border. And then we're also talking about what's happening in family detention centers. And I think a lot of people look at those stories side by side and notice an asymmetry. Notice that the Trump administration is sending back asylum seekers under the guise of not wanting to spread COVID-19. And at the same time, we have a federal judge ringing an alarm saying that this virus is spreading inside of facilities like these ICE detention centers, and that is why they want these families and children released. And yet you have the Trump administration dragging their feet on that. How do you square those contrasting rationales?
Well, the Trump administration is keeping families in these detention centers when they could be safe and together with sponsors in the United States. Instead, they're being held in congregate care facilities where there's a lack of social distancing, a lack of soap, and where dozens of people are already infected. And in fact, the federal government is moving additional people into those facilities. So really, they are becoming super spreaders of COVID itself. So for the government to claim that the ban that they have at the border is in order to prevent COVID from spreading, it makes no sense. In fact, the children at the border are being held in facilities at hotels out in the community. And so COVID will continue to spread.
Lindsay, thank you, as always.